Before we begin tonight, I want you to think about the last time you held a piece of coal, or a lump of charcoal, or even a pencil which is made of graphite, which is a form of carbon. Whatever it was, that black, dense, compressed material was once a living tree, not just any tree, a tree that was alive 300 million years ago in a forest so vast, so dense, so unlike anything on Earth today that it wrapped around the entire equatorial region of the planet like a belt of darkness. A forest where insects flew with wingspans of 70 centimeters, where millipedes stretched for 2 meters, where the air itself was different from anything you've ever breathed. That's where we're going tonight, to the world before the dinosaurs, to the world that made the coal that powered the Industrial Revolution, to a planet you wouldn't recognize. But first, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and whether you've ever stood in an old-growth forest and felt something you couldn't quite name. Drop it in the comments before you fall asleep. I read every single one. Now, let's go back 360 million years. Opening, there's a forest. It has no name because there is no one to name it. No one who could. It covers more of the earth than the Amazon covers today. And it is own sea. And it is alive. And it will outlast everything you have ever known. The trees are not like any tree living today. They are club mosses. Lepidodendron. They grow 30 to 40 meters tall. Their trunks are covered in diamond-shaped scars, the marks of fallen leaves, pressed into the bark like a pattern, like a code, a language, written in the skin of the tree, that no one will ever read. The ground is wet, permanently soaked through a vast swamp that goes on for as far as sight can reach. And further, much further, the roots of the trees reach into the black water. And the water is dark. Dark because of the tannins from the fallen vegetation. Dark because almost no light reaches the surface. The canopy is too dense, too complete. The sun exists somewhere above. But down here, in the understory, there's only a dim, green, underwater light. And in the air above the canopy, something is flying. Something with wings wider than an eagle, wider than a hawk. Something that shouldn't exist by any modern understanding of what insects can be, but it does exist. It has always existed in this world, this specific world that ran for 60 million years, before the first dinosaur was ever born. This is the Carboniferous period, 358 to 299 million years ago. The world before everything we think of as ancient. And tonight, I want to take you there, a planet you don't recognize. The Earth at 360 million years old. Let me tell you what the planet looked like 360 million years ago, because the geography alone is enough to disorient. There's one supercontinent forming, or rather two large land masses in the process of collision, Euramerica in the north, Gondwana in the south. They are coming together, slowly, grinding together at their edges, building mountains in the process. The Appalachians, which now seem ancient and worn, were in the Carboniferous as tall and sharp as the modern Himalayas, fresh from the collision, raw and dramatic. Before 300 million years of erosion wore them down to gentle ridges, the equatorial region, where most of the great coal forests grew, was humid, tropical, consistently hot. The climate was not uniform across the planet. There were polar ice caps at times, glaciation in the south. On Gondwana, the ice ages of the Carboniferous, pulsing in and out, but at the equator, it was always warm, always wet, a permanent tropical climate, driven by the position of the continents and the composition of the atmosphere, which was very different from what you breathe now. The oxygen, this is the first thing you would notice. If you stepped into the Carboniferous, not the giant insects, not the enormous trees. The air was richer in oxygen, muchricher. Today's atmosphere is about 21% oxygen. In the Carboniferous, at the peak, it may have reached 35%, maybe higher. Some estimates say up to 35%. Some say potentially more, 35% oxygen instead of 21%. What would that feel like? You might feel slightly euphoric, more alert, more energized, or if the concentration was high enough, slightly dizzy. The world at 35% oxygen is a world where fires burn hotter and faster, where wildfires spread more readily, where combustion happens more easily, where every living thing is exposed to an atmosphere, more energetically charged than anything we know, and where, as it turned out, insects could grow to sizes that would seem impossible today. The coal forests, trees that changed the world. Let me tell you about the trees, because the trees are the heart of the Carboniferous. The trees are the reason for everything, for the giant insects, for the oxygen-rich atmosphere, for the coal that powered the 19th century, for the climate that shaped 60 million years of life. The trees are where the story begins. The dominant trees of the Carboniferous coal forests were not like any tree alive today. They were lycopsids, clubbed mosses, which today are small, ground-hugging plants. You might walk past them in a temperate forest without noticing them. Tiny, modest, inconspicuous. In the Carboniferous, the same group grew to 40 meters and formed the dominant canopy of the largest forest the world has ever seen. Lepidodendron, the scale tree, one of the most common trees of the Carboniferous. Photiomeanthus tal, with a trunk that tapered from base to crown, covered in diamond-shaped leaf scars left behind as each leaf fell, like a pattern pressed into skin. The pattern was so regular, so geometric, that the first fossil trunks were thought to be the scales of a giant reptile, not a tree, because no one had imagined that a tree could look like that. The base of Lepidodendron was a branching root system called stigmaria, spreading wide into the saturated soil of the coal swamp, not deep. These were not trees with deep taproots. They were trees that spread their roots horizontally through the shallow, waterlogged soil, anchoring in the mud, drawing up water from an environment that had plenty of it. They grew fast. Modern estimates suggest that Lepidodendron reached its full height quickly, in decades rather than centuries, and then it flowered and died, all at once, like a giant annual plant, monocarpic, flowering once and then gone. A tree that grew 40 meters tall, lived for decades, and then flowered and died in a single season, falling into the swamp and joining the accumulating mass of organic material that, over millions of years, would become coal. Sigillaria, another common lycopsid tree, similar in size to Lepidodendron, but with different trunk markings, vertical rows of leaf scars, rather than diamond-shaped ones, grouped together in pairs, like eyes, running up the length of the trunk in vertical lines, a different pattern, a different appearance, but the same basic architecture, the same strategy, living in the same swamp, contributing to the same accumulation, the same future coal. Col d'Italien, the early relatives of conifers, were also present, tall trees with strap-like leaves, more primitive than modern conifers, but already occupying the ecological role that conifers would play in every world that followed. And calamite, the giant horsetails, which today grow to about a meter, in the Carboniferous, reached 20 to 30 meters, tree-sized horsetails with the same jointed, hollow stems and whorled leaves as modern horsetails, but enormous, towering, growing in the wettest parts of the swamp, along the margins of the waterways, in dense extents, their hollow stems providing homes for the insects and animals that lived in and around them. The ferns, enormous tree ferns, with fronds the size of small trees themselves, filling the understory. The space between the giant lycopsids and the canopy, a second tier of greenery in the dim, filtered light below the canopy. This world was green in a way that nothing in modern experience can quite capture. Not the tropical rainforest, not the Pacific Northwest, not any forest you have ever been in, was as comprehensively, densely, overwhelmingly green as the Carboniferous coal swamp, a world where plant life had taken over every available surface. Every centimeter of ground, every centimeter of water margin, every centimeter of rock face was covered in plant life, in green, in living things, photosynthesizing, producing oxygen, building carbon day after day, year after year, million year after million year. Why did the trees make coal? This is the question that took science centuries to answer. And the answer is surprising. When a tree dies today, it decomposes. Bacteria and fungi break it down, release the carbon stored in its wood back into the atmosphere as CO2. The carbon cycle, the continuous recycling of carbon between the atmosphere and the living world. In the Carboniferous, this didn't happen, or barely happened, because the fungi and bacteria that today decompose wood had not yet fully evolved. The specific enzymes that break down lignin, the tough structural compound that makes wood woody, didn't exist yet, or were only beginning to appear in the late Carboniferous. Lignin is hard to break down. It requires specific fungal enzymes, the white rot fungi, that today can decompose lignin. These did not yet exist in the full sense at the beginning of the Carboniferous. So when a lepidodendron fell into the coal swamp, it didn't rot, not fully. It accumulated tree on top of tree, layer on layer, century after century, building up the deep organic deposits that compressed under the weight of more material above, and over millions of years became peat, and then lignite, and then coal. The coal seams that power stations burned in the 19th and 20th centuries are the accumulated bodies of Carboniferous trees. Every ton of coal was once a forest, was once alive, was once photosynthesizing in the sunlight of a planet that existed 300 million years before you were born. The carbon in that coal was pulled from the Carboniferous atmosphere by the trees and locked away in the coal instead of being recycled back to the atmosphere as it would be today. This process pulled so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that CO2 levels dropped dramatically through the Carboniferous, which contributed to the cooling climate, to the Carboniferous ice ages, to the eventual end of the great coal swamps. And when we burn that coal, we are releasing the carbon that was locked away 300 million years ago. We are returning the Carboniferous atmosphere to the sky in decades, what took millions of years to remove. Why insects grew giant, the physics of breathing. Now the insects, because this is what everyone wants to know. How did they get so big? And the answer is both scientific and deeply strange. Insects breathe differently from us. We breathe through lungs. We have a dedicated respiratory system. Blood carries oxygen from the lungs to every cell in the body. Active transport, powered by the heart. Insects breathe through tracheae, a network of tubes that run through the body, opening at the surface through spiracles, small holes along the sides of the body and branching internally into finer and finer tubes until they reach individual cells. The oxygen diffuses directly from the air through the tracheal tubes to the tissues without a blood carrier, without a pumping heart. Diffusion is passive. It doesn't require energy, but it has a limit. The rate of diffusion decreases with distance. The further the cell is from the air, the less efficiently it can receive oxygen. This limits insect size. In today's atmosphere, with 21% oxygen, the diffusion gradient limits insect to a certain maximum size, above which the innermost cells simply can't get enough oxygen through the tracheal system, but at 35% oxygen, the diffusion gradient is steeper. Oxygen diffuses faster, further, more efficiently. The limit shifts outward. Larger insects can survive because the oxygen-rich air can reach cells that would be oxygen deprived. In today's atmosphere, this is the simple version, the elegant, satisfying explanation. More oxygen equals bigger insects. Less oxygen equals smaller insects. And there is evidence to support it. The largest dragonflies in the fossil record appear at the same time as the highest oxygen levels. In the geological record, the correlation is there, but it's not the whole story. Scientists have debated whether oxygen alone explains the extreme sizes of Carboniferous insects. Some argue that predation or competition or available food also played a role. The absence of vertebrate competition in certain ecological niches may have allowed insects to grow into sizes that would be outcompeted by vertebrates today in our world. Large flying vertebrates, birds and bats, dominate the aerial niches that large insects once occupied. In the Carboniferous, there were no birds, no bats. The sky belonged to the insects entirely, and they grew to fill it. The giants, arthropods and meganera. Let me introduce you to the animals that will stay with you long after tonight. Meganeura. Meganeura monyi, the largest flying insect that has ever existed. A griffin fly, not technically a dragonfly, though related. A member of the order Meganisoptera, extinct now, but enormous. The wingspan 65 to 75 centimeters. At the largest specimens, some estimates put it at 70 centimeters wingtip to wingtip. To put that in perspective, a large American bald eagle has a wingspan of about 200 centimeters, but the eagle is a large bird with hollow bones and a highly optimized flying body. Meganeura was an insect with a 50 centimeter wingspan, the size of a large crow or a small hawk, but made of chitin and compound eyes and 6 legs. And the body plan of an insect, it was a predator, like modern dragonflies, which are some of the most effective aerial predators on Earth, catching prey mid-air with a success rate that exceeds most vertebrate predators. Meganeura did the same on a larger scale, hunting other insects, perhaps small amphibians, perhaps anything that it could catch and hold with its legs and dispatch with its mouthparts. Arthropods armata, the largest terrestrial arthropod that has ever lived. A millipede relative, though not a true millipede, a member of an extinct group called arthropods. The size, the largest specimens estimated at 2 to 2.6 meters long and perhaps 50 centimeters wide, 2.5 meters. The length of a small car. Let that settle for a moment. A millipede, the length of a small car, moving through the coal swamp. On dozens of legs, the body was armored, plates of exoskeleton, covering the dorsal surface, articulated like the joints of a suit of armor, allowing the body to flex as it moved over and around obstacles. The ground in the Carboniferous forest was not smooth. It was a tangle of roots and fallen logs and pools of water, and Arthropods moved through all of it. What did it eat? For a long time, this was unclear. The gut contents of one fossil specimen were analyzed and contained spores and plant material, not animal remains. Arthropods was a herbivore, a detritivore, a consumer of fallen plant material, of decaying vegetation, of the endless accumulation of dead plant matter. In the coal swamp, a recycler of the forest's dead. This is somehow more strange to me than if it had been a predator, a plant-eating millipede, 2.5 meters long, moving through the forest floor, eating fallen leaves and rotten wood, as mundane in its habits as a modern earthworm, but the size of a car. Arthropods trackways have been found, fossil footprints, pressed into the soft sediment of the Carboniferous coal swamp, running in straight lines through what was once a mudflat. At the edge of the swamp, the tracks show that Arthropods moved quickly. For an animal its size, a determined, purposeful movement, not the slow meander of a modern millipede, but something more substantial, more present. In the landscape, the tracks were discovered in Scotland in 2029 in sandstone on a beach near Edinburgh, left by an animal that walked across a mudflat 328 million years ago and are now visible on a Scottish beach in the 21st century, the footprints of a 2-meter millipede waiting to be found. For 328 million years, Pulmonoscorpius, the lung scorpion, a terrestrial scorpion from the Carboniferous of Scotland, about 70 centimeters long, not as long as modern large scorpions, which can reach 20 centimeters, but 70 centimeters, 3.5 times the size of the largest modern scorpion. Pulmonoscorpius had book lungs, like modern scorpions, but adapted for terrestrial life. It was fully capable of living on land, hunting on land, in the coal forest understory, a predator of small animals. That would have included amphibians and other arthropods and anything small enough to be caught and stung. Eucalyptus, as a scorpion, an eurypterid, not an insect, but an arthropod, living in the water around the same period earlier in the late Silurian and Devonian, but deserving mention because Eucalyptus rhenanii is estimated to have reached 2.5 meters in length, the largest arthropod of any kind that has ever been found. Sea scorpions in the ancient seas, Duoticlima metres long, a predator of fish, of other sea scorpions, of anything that crossed its path. In the ancient oceans, these were not mythological creatures. These were real. Their fossils are in museums. Their tracks are on beaches. Their bodies existed in a world that was real, that had weather and seasons and sunrises and sunsets and creatures that hunted and were hunted and lived and died in a world that most of us have never been taught to imagine. Life in the water, the ancient swamps and seas. The Carboniferous was not just a terrestrial world. The water was as extraordinary as the land. The coal swamps were full of water, permanent bodies of still, dark water. Between the trees, dark from tannins, dark from the density of the vegetation above. Warm, sluggish, rich in decomposing organic matter. In that water lived the ancestors of everything. That would come after the fish of the Carboniferous were diverse. The Devonian, the period before the Carboniferous, had been the age of fish. And by the Carboniferous, fish had been developing for hundreds of millions of years. The cartilaginous fish, the sharks and their relatives, were already well established and already diverse. The sharks of the Carboniferous were strange. By modern standards, Stethecanthus, the ironing board shark with a bizarre anvil-shaped structure on the dorsal surface, covered in tooth-like scales called denticles. The same denticles covered the top of the head, giving the shark a distinctive and deeply puzzling appearance. What was the anvil for? Possibly display, possibly some role in mating, possibly something that we simply cannot reconstruct from a fossil, Falcatus, another strange Carboniferous shark in which the males had a curved hook-like structure growing from behind the head, pointing forward over the head, like a unicorn horn made of bone. The females lacked this structure, clearly a secondary sexual characteristic used in display or in mating in a way that we can only speculate about from the fossils. And Helicoprion, the world-toothed shark, whose teeth grew in a spiral of teeth that wound around like a saw blade or a coiled shell. For decades, paleontologists couldn't figure out where the tooth whorl sat in the shark's mouth. Was it in the lower jaw, the upper jaw, sticking out from the front? Eventually, CT scanning of the fossils revealed the answer. The tooth whorl sat in the lower jaw at the back, folding up as new teeth grew and old ones were pushed back into the spiral. A unique and deeply bizarre dental arrangement that no other animal has ever developed. The amphibians, the Carboniferous, was the age of the amphibians, in the same way that the Mesozoic was the age of the dinosaurs, the first tetrapods. The first four-limbed vertebrates had emerged from the water in the Devonian just before the Carboniferous. The transition from fish to tetrapod, the transition from water to land, the most significant ecological crossing in the history of vertebrate life. By the Carboniferous, the amphibians had diversified into a remarkable array of forms. Eriops, a large amphibian about 2 meters long, with a heavy, robust body, a broad, flat head, short legs that could support the body's weight on land, but probably moved more comfortably in shallow water or at the water's edge. Eriops was a predator of fish and other animals that lived in and around the water. Diplosaurus, perhaps the strangest of the Carboniferous amphibians. With a boomerang-shaped head, the skull was extended on both sides into long, sweeping horns, or lobes, making the head wider than the body, dramatically wider. What was the boomerang head for? Hydrodynamics? Possibly. The wide head may have acted like the wings of a stingray, generating lift as water passed over it, allowing the animal to rise and sink in the water column with minimal effort. Or it may have been difficult for a predator to swallow a head that was much wider than the body, a defensive adaptation that made Diplocaulus a challenging meal for any predator that tried to eat it. And the lepospondylus, the eel-like legless amphibians, istopoda, that had re-evolved a limbless body plan, perhaps for burrowing, perhaps for moving through the dense root systems of the coal swamp. Evolutionary convergence on the snake body plan. Before snakes existed, the same solution, found independently by a completely different lineage, to the same problem of moving through confined spaces. The first reptiles land conquered at last in the coal swamps, among the giant trees and the giant insects and the large amphibians. Something new was happening, something that would change everything. The first reptiles were evolving. Reptiles are amniote. Their eggs have a special membrane, the amnion, that keeps the embryo moist without needing to be laid in water. This was the key, the innovation that freed vertebrates from permanent dependence on water. Amphibians have to return to water to breed. Their eggs had no amnion, dry out. If laid on land, the amphibians had conquered land for feeding, for moving, for hunting, but for reproduction, they were still tied to the water. The amniote egg changed that with an egg that could be laid on dry land that wouldn't dry out, that protected the embryo in its own private aquatic environment. The amniote vertebrates were free to move away from water completely, to colonize the dry uplands, the rocky slopes, the places where amphibians couldn't go, to breed the earliest known amniote as Hylonomus lieli from the Carboniferous of Nova Scotia, about 315 million years old, found in the hollow stumps of lycopsid trees in the coal swamp. Hylonomus looked like a small lizard, about 20 centimeters long, with a pointed snout and a long tail, probably insectivorous, catching the abundant small insects of the forest floor. It was small, modest, unremarkable to look at, but Hylonomus was the ancestor of everything, every reptile, every bird, every mammal, every human being traces its amniote heritage back to animals like Hylonomus, back to that small lizard-like creature in the hollow stump of a Carboniferous tree 315 million years ago. From Hylonomus, the amniotes diversified in two main directions: the sauropsids, the lineage leading to reptiles and birds, and the synapsids, the lineage leading to mammals, including us. Both lineages were present in the Carboniferous, both already diverging, taking their first steps in different directions that would, hundreds of millions of years later, lead to the full diversity of modern vertebrate life. The Carboniferous was not just the age of giant insects. It was the moment when the vertebrate world made a critical turn, when the land was truly claimed for the first time, not just for feeding, but for living and breeding and dying in the full sense. The atmosphere that made everything 35% oxygen and what it meant. I want to come back to the atmosphere because it is the engine of everything in the Carboniferous, the high oxygen, the changing CO2, the way the trees were slowly reshaping the air. The Carboniferous began with the relatively high CO2 levels and moderate oxygen. As the great coal swamps expanded, as the trees pulled CO2 from the atmosphere and locked it in their bodies, in the peat, in the coal, CO2 levels dropped, oxygen levels rose. The rise in oxygen was not gradual. It was dramatic, from around 15% in the early Carboniferous to potentially 35% in the late Carboniferous, a more than doubling of atmospheric oxygen. Over 60 million years, the effects were profound. Fire in an atmosphere with 35% oxygen, fire burns differently, more readily, more intensely, more persistently. The Carboniferous forest was a fire-prone world, evidence of charcoal. Fossil charcoal, called fusane, is abundant in Carboniferous coal seams, evidence of wildfires that swept through the coal forests regularly, possibly seasonally, burning the accumulated dead wood and undergrowth and starting again from the surviving stumps. The Carboniferous was a world that burned and regrew and burned again in a cycle driven by the oxygen that the trees themselves produced. The wildfires were part of the ecology, not a catastrophe, not an exception, a regular feature of the Carboniferous landscape. The trees had adapted to survive fire or to regenerate quickly. After it, the animals had adapted to the cycles of burning and regrowth. The insects, the high oxygen, not only allowed insects to grow large, it changed the entire character of insect life. More oxygen means more metabolic rate, means more activity, means more predation, means more evolution. The Carboniferous insects were not just large, they were active, energetics, diverse, filling ecological roles that no insect fills today. The first flying insects, the Carboniferous, is also the period when insect flight first appears clearly. In the fossil record, the origin of insect flight is one of the great unresolved questions of evolutionary biology. Did wings evolve from extensions of the thorax used for gliding, from gill plates, from temperature regulation? The exact origin is still debated, but by the Carboniferous, insects were flying, diverse in their wing structures, diverse in their flight styles, diverse in their ecology. The Carboniferous is the oldest period for which we have abundant evidence of flying insects, and they were already remarkable, already diverse, already occupying the ecological niches that flying insects occupy today: predators, herbivores, detritivores, pollinators, though without the flowering plants that modern pollinators serve. The Carboniferous pollinators visited the spore-bearing plants of the coal forest in a different kind of relationship between animal and plant. The great coal swamps, the engine of the modern world. Let me take you deep into the swamp itself, not to the edge, not to the uplands, into the center, the heart of the coal swamp, where the water is deepest and the trees are tallest and the light is dimmest. The water is black, stained by tannins from thousands of years of fallen leaves and bark and dead vegetation. The surface is still barely moving, covered here and there with mats of floating algae or fauwelfrons. From the tree ferns above, the roots of the lepidodendron trees enter the water at all angles, the stigmaria roots spreading horizontally just beneath the surface, creating a tangle, an underwater web of living wood in the dark water. The noise, there is noise here, not the bird calls of a modern forest. No birds exist yet, but insect calls, the stridulations of ancient orthopteran relative, creating a constant background sound that fills the space. The way birds fill a modern forest, the smell would be overwhelming to modern senses. The sulfurous smell of anaerobic decomposition in the waterlogged soil, the rich vegetable smell of living plant matter, the smell of wet bark and wet earth and wet air saturated with moisture in a tropical climate that never fully dries. On a fallen look, half submerged in the water, something moves slowly, the head of an amphibian rising from the water, watching, then sinking again without sound. Above, in the canopy, something large passes, a shadow crossing the dim light from one direction to another, too large for any modern flying thing, too quiet for its size. The broad, transparent wings barely audible, at this distance and on the ground, moving steadily through the leaf litter, the plates of its armor catching the faint light on arthropods moving through the undergrowth, without hurry, without awareness, of being observed from across 360 million years. This was a real place. This specific combination of water and tree and insect and amphibian was a real ecosystem that existed for 60 million years. 60 million years. The same duration as the entire Cenozoic era, the age of mammals, from the death of the dinosaurs to today. The coal swamps lasted as long as the entire age of mammals. They were not a brief episode. They were a world, a stable, persistent, enduring world that shaped everything that came after it. Part 9. The Carboniferous Ice Ages. When the cold came uninvited, the Carboniferous was not continuously warm. The tropics were warm and wet and stayed that way, but the southern polar region, Gondwana, the supercontinent of the south, experienced glaciation. The Gondwana glaciations began in the late Carboniferous and intensified into the Permian, a series of ice ages driven partly by the falling CO2 that the coal forests were causing as they pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locked it in coal. The greenhouse effect weakened, the planet cooled, at least at the poles. These ice ages were not continuous. They pulsed, glacial periods, separated by warmer interglacials, in a rhythm driven by orbital mechanics, the same Milankovitch cycles that drive ice ages today. The effects were significant. The sea levels rose and fell. As ice sheets grew and shrank, the coal swamps expanded and contracted. In response, the climate of the tropics became more variable, more seasonal than it had been. In the early Carboniferous, this variability had evolutionary consequences. Species that could tolerate a wider range of conditions had an advantage. Species that were highly specialized for the continuous wet tropics struggled as the climate became less predictable, less stable. The first signs of the coming end of the coal swamp world were here in the ice ages of the late Carboniferous, in the cooling and the drying and the fragmentation of the great forest, the transition to the Permian, the world beginning to change. As the Carboniferous ended and the Permian began about 299 million years ago, the world was changing in ways that would profoundly alter the character of life on Earth. The climate was cooling and drying. The coal swamps were retreating, fragmented by the changing climate, by the advancing dryness of the interior of the forming supercontinent. Pangaea was almost complete. Laurasia and Gondwana almost fully merged into one landmass that extended from pole to pole, from the Arctic to Antarctica. The interior of Pangaea was vast and dry, far from any sea. The moisture that the oceans provided could not penetrate to the center of a landmass that large. The climate of the interior was extreme: hot summers, cold winters, dry, very dry, not the tropical wetland of the coal swamp the lycopsid trees, which had dominated the coal forests, were adapted to wet conditions, to the waterlogged soils of tropical swamps. They couldn't handle dry conditions. They couldn't handle seasonality. They were specialists of a very specific environment. As that environment changed, as the climate dried, they retreated to refugia in the last wet places and eventually were replaced by the seed plants, the gymnosperms, which were better adapted to drier conditions, to the variable climate of the Permian world. The giant insects also declined as oxygen levels dropped from the Carboniferous peak back toward modern levels, as the coal forest shrank and produced less oxygen. The atmospheric oxygen declined, and with it, the size advantage of the giant insects disappeared. The giant dragonflies, the Meganeura and its relatives, went extinct. Before the end of the Permian, the era of giant insects ended not suddenly, but gradually, as the atmosphere changed, as the environment changed, as the world became a different place. The synapsids, the mammal-like reptiles, became the dominant large terrestrial vertebrates of the Permian. Strange sail-backed animals, Dimetrodon, which many people mistake for a dinosaur, was actually a synapsid, more closely related to you than to any dinosaur. Ruling the land of the early Permian, Dimetrodon, with its tall sail made of extended vertebral spines, covered in skin, full of blood vessels, acted as a thermoregulator, turning toward the sun in the morning to absorb heat quickly and warm to operating temperature faster than its prey and competitors, an advantage in the seasonally variable climate of the early Permian. What the Permian built the world before the end. The Permian, 299 to 252 million years ago, 47 million years, was the period when, after the Carboniferous, life adjusted, consolidated, diversified into new forms, suited to the drier, more seasonal, more variable world. The synapsids diversified into a remarkable variety of forms, from the sailback Dimetrodon to the Dicynodonts, large herbivorous synapsids with two tusks and a beak that processed tough vegetation, filling the ecological roles that large herbivores fill today. And the therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles that were already beginning to show the features we associate with mammals: differentiated teeth, erect posture, possibly warm blood. In some lineages, the transition from reptile to mammal was happening through the Permian in the synapsid lineage that would eventually, 200 million years later, produce. The Permian was also the time of the great arid deserts in the interior of Pangaea. The red sandstones of the Permian, found across Europe and North America, tell the story of a vast, hot, dry, windswept world, the new red sandstone. In Britain, the Rotliegend. In Germany, the Permian red beds of Texas and New Mexico, all formed from the wind-blown sand of the Permian Desert of the interior of Pangaea, a world of red sand and dry wind and seasonal extremes that would be alien to anyone who had grown up in the green, wet, oxygen-rich world of the Carboniferous coal swamp, the great dying, the end of almost everything. 252 million years ago, something happened that makes the extinction of the dinosaurs look modest. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, the Great Dying, the largest mass extinction in the history of complex life. 96% of all marine species gone, 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species gone, a world that had been building and diversifying and filling every possible niche for hundreds of millions of years, reduced in a geological moment to a handful of survivors clinging to existence in a devastated world. What caused it? The Siberian traps, the largest volcanic eruption in the last 500 million years. Massive flood basalt volcanism in what is now Siberia that released unprecedented volumes of CO2 and sulfur dioxide and other toxic gases into the atmosphere over perhaps 1 million years or less. The warming was catastrophic. CO2 levels rose rapidly. Global temperatures increased by 10 degrees or more. The oceans warmed, became anoxic, depleted of oxygen, acidified as CO2 dissolved into the water. The ocean chemistry changed fundamentally. In the ocean, most life died. The coral reefs essentially collapsed. The marine ecosystems that had been building since the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago were wiped away in a few tens of thousands of years. On land, the warming and the drought, the toxic gases from the volcanic activity killed the forests, killed the animals that depended on them. The food chains collapsed from the bottom as the plants died first, and the herbivores followed, and the carnivores followed. The recovery took 10 million years, 10 million years of ecological simplicity, of a world dominated by opportunists, by species that could survive in degraded conditions before the ecosystems began to rebuild themselves into something complex, into something rich, into the world that would eventually produce the dinosaurs, what the Carboniferous left behind, the legacy written in stone. Let me tell you what the Carboniferous left for the world that followed, for the world we live in. The coal, the most obvious legacy, the compressed bodies of Carboniferous trees locked away for 300 million years and burned by industrial civilization. In 200 years, about half of all the coal that was ever burned in human history was burned in the 20th century. Most of the rest in the 19th century, and the small fraction earlier. The coal powered the Industrial Revolution, the steam engines, the smelting furnaces, the railways, the ships, the electricity generation, the transformation of the human world from agricultural to industrial was powered by the Carboniferous forest, by the bodies of Lepidodendron and the Sigillaria, and the other trees of the coal swamp. The carbon dioxide that the Carboniferous trees removed from the atmosphere and locked in coal is now being returned. As we burn the coal, we are running the Carboniferous carbon cycle in reverse at 100 times the speed carbon that was removed over 60 million years. is being returned. In 200 years, the chemistry of our atmosphere is being altered by the burning of ancient sunlight captured by ancient trees in an ancient world that existed 300 million years before us. The genetic legacy, the Carboniferous, is when the amniote egg appeared, the innovation that allowed vertebrates to fully conquer land, that allowed the lineages that would lead to reptiles, birds, mammals, us, to exist without the amniote egg. Vertebrate life would have remained tied to the water, would not have colonized the dry uplands, the deserts, the mountains, the full breadth of the terrestrial world. The Carboniferous gave us this, the freedom of the land, through the evolution of one membrane around one egg in one small lizard-like animal, in a hollow tree stump, in the coal swamp. The insect legacy, the insects that dominate the land today, the most successful group of animals on Earth in terms of species number, in terms of biomass, in terms of ecological importance, began their dominance in the Carboniferous, the first flying insects, the first diversification of insect body plans, the first great radiation of the group that would eventually include the beetles and the ants and the bees and the moths and the flies and the wasps and everything else that buzzes and crawls in the world today, the Devonian before it, what came before the Carboniferous. To understand the Carboniferous fully, we need to know what came before the Devonian period, 419 to 359 million years ago, the age of fish. The Devonian was the period when fish diversified into a remarkable variety of forms. The placoderms, the armored fish with bony plates covering the head and front of the body, the acanthodians, the spiny sharks, the lobe-finned fish that would give rise to the tetrapods, the first land vertebrates. The lobe-finned fish are perhaps the most important animals of the Devonian. Their fins had a fleshy lobe at the base with bones inside that correspond to the bones of a tetrapod limb, the humerus, the radius, the ulna. The bones of your arm can be traced through millions of years of evolution back to the fin bones of a Devonian lobe-finned fish, Dictali crocei, found in the Canadian Arctic in 2004 by a team led by Neil Shubin, is one of the most famous transitional fossils ever found. A fish with a neck, with a rib cage, with fins that had the internal structure, ophalimb, that could bend and push the body against the substrate. Dictalic could prop itself up on its fins and look around in a way that a modern fish cannot. It could hold its body above the surface of shallow water or the muddy margin of a Devonian river and see what was there. On the other side, Dictalic was not the first to cross, but Dictalic shows us what the crossing looked like. What kind of animal did it? A fish that was already almost a land animal that had already evolved most of what it needed to make the step from water to land. The first forests also appeared in the Devonian Cladoxylopsida, strange tree-like plants that grew in the late Devonian were among the first trees, and their evolution had a profound effect on the Devonian climate, drawing CO2 from the atmosphere, as the Carboniferous trees would do on a much larger scale. Later, the Devonian cooling caused by the first forests contributed to the end Devonian extinction event, one of the 5 largest in the history of complex life, the Ordovician and Silurian. Even older worlds, let me take you even further back to the worlds before the Devonian, to the ancient oceans, when life was still mostly in the water. The Silurian, 443 to 419 million years ago, was the period when life first appeared in significant quantities on land. Arthropods had already colonized land in the Silurian, or possibly the Ordovician, before small terrestrial arthropods, millipedes. Early arachnids, possibly early insects, were already living in the coastal environments of the Silurian world. The Silurian seas were rich coral reefs of a kind, not the coral reefs we know today. Modern coral reefs are built primarily by scleractinian corals, which didn't appear until the Triassic. Silurian reefs were built by rugose corals and tabulate corals and stromatoporids, sponge-like organisms that built carbonate structures in the warm, shallow seas. The Eurypterids, the sea scorpions, were dominant in the Silurian seas. We mentioned Aecolopterus from the Devonian. The large sea scorpions were a major part of the marine ecosystem of the Silurian and Devonian, the apex predators of those ancient seas before the fish took over the Ordovician 485 to 443 million years ago. Had the Ordovician biodiversification event, the second great radiation of animal life. After the Cambrian explosion, the oceans filled with bizarre and beautiful things. Trilobites, brachiopods, echinoderms, graptolith, nautiloid cephalopods with shells, straight or coiled, predators of the ancient sea. And the Ordovician ended with a mass extinction, one of the 5 largest, possibly triggered by a gamma ray burst from a nearby supernova that stripped the ozone layer and exposed the surface ocean to deadly ultraviolet radiation. A hypothesis still debated, but remarkable. If true, the first mass extinction of complex life may have been caused by a star dying somewhere in the Milky Way, the Cambrian explosion where animals began 541 million years ago. The Cambrian, the moment that changed everything. Before the Cambrian, life was mostly simple, microbial or soft-bodied, enigmatic. Then, in the space of 20 million years or less, almost all the major body plans of animals alive today appeared in the fossil record. For the first time, eyes, for the first time, shells, for the first time, jointed limbs, for the first time, active predation, for the first time, the Burgess Shale in British Columbia and the Xinjiang biota in China preserve the Cambrian animals in extraordinary detail. In the soft shale, the bodies of animals that normally would have decomposed leaving no trace, were preserved in fine-grained mud on the bottom of an ocean sea. Anomalocaris, the anomalous shrimp, the largest predator of the Cambrian seas, about a meter long, with two grasping appendages at the front and a circular mouth, with radiating plates for crushing prey and compound eyes, among the most sophisticated in any Cambrian animal. Opabinia, 5 eyes, and Aproboschis, tipped with a claw, a strange swimmer that defies easy categorization, that doesn't fit neatly into any modern group, a reminder that evolution explores possibilities that later get closed off, that the history of life contains experiments that were tried and abandoned, or that led nowhere, or that led everywhere, and we just can't see the connection from here. Hallucigenia, named for its bizarre appearance. When first described, it was reconstructed upside down, with the spines as legs and the legs as spines, a worm-like animal with spines along its back and legs along its belly. That confused everyone for decades before the orientation was finally established by finding the head, which had been mistaken for the tail, and the front of the tail mistaken for the head. The Cambrian is the beginning of the animal world we recognize, the beginning of the tree that all animals alive today descend from the Carboniferous insects and the Carboniferous trees and the Carboniferous fish and the first amniotes in the hollow stumps all trace their lineage back to those first Cambrian animals in the shallow seas of 541 million years ago. The deep ocean past, what lived in the ancient seas. The history of ocean life is longer than the history of land life, much longer. The ocean is where life began, where it lived for most of its history before any animal crawled onto land. The Ediacaran, the period just before the Cambrian, 635 to 541 million years ago, contains the first macroscopic multicellular organisms, the Ediacaran biota, soft-bodied, strange, not easily assigned to any modern group. Dickinsonia, an oval quilted organism that grew by adding segments at one end and may have absorbed nutrients through its base, like a living mat on the seafloor. Charnia, a frond-like organism anchored to the seafloor, possibly photosynthetic in the shallow water or filter feeding in the dark. These Ediacaran organisms are strange because they don't fit into any modern framework. Not quite animals, not quite plants, not quite fungi, something else. An early experiment in multicellular life that may have left descendants among modern groups, or may have been a completely dead end, a failed kingdom that thrived for 100 million years and then vanished in the Cambrian without leaving any living descendants. We don't know. The deep ocean past is mostly invisible to us because the ocean floor is constantly being recycled by plate tectonics. The ocean floor is younger than the oldest continental rock. By far, the oldest ocean floor is about 200 million years old. In the Western Pacific, everything older has been subducted, pushed beneath the continents, melted, reabsorbed into the mantle. The pre-Jurassic ocean floor is gone forever. We know the ancient ocean only through the sediments that were deposited on it and then pushed onto land by tectonic collision. The limestone of the Alps contains Cretaceous marine fossils. The limestone was once the floor of the Tethys Sea. It is now a mountain range, the ancient ocean, made solid, made vertical, made accessible by geology, the world beneath your feet, what you're standing on. Here is something that will change how you think about the ground you stand on every day. The coal fields of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, the Ruhr Valley of Germany, the Yorkshire coal field of England, the Donbass of Ukraine. All of these are the remains of the Carboniferous coal swamps. All of them, the coal seams, are the compressed bodies of Carboniferous trees. They are laid out in horizontal layers, matching the original horizontal surface of the coal swamp, layer upon layer of compressed vegetation going down into the earth. When you drive over a coal field, you are driving over the ancient swamp. When you walk through the mining valleys of Wales or Pennsylvania, you are walking over the coal forest, over the roots of lepidodendron trees, over the paths that arthropods walked, over the pools where Meganeura hunted 360 million years ago. The limestone of the Carboniferous also exists in enormous quantities across Europe and North America. The Carboniferous limestone was formed from the accumulated shells and skeletons of marine organisms in the warm, shallow seas that surrounded the coal swamps. The Uredale sequence of northern England, the alternating limestone and shale and sandstone records the pulsing of the Carboniferous ice ages as the sea rose and fell in response to the growth and retreat of the Gondwana ice sheets, each cycle leaving a different layer of rock. In the sequence, the Peak District of Derbyshire, the limestone pavements of the Yorkshire Dales, the dramatic gorges of the Avon and the Wye are carved into Carboniferous limestone into the remains of a tropical sea that existed 360 million years ago in a world that bore no resemblance to England today. You walk on the past every day without knowing it. The deep time is under your feet. All of it, the meaning of deep time, what 360 million years teaches us. I want to sit with something for a moment, something that the Carboniferous makes unavoidable. If you really think about it, deep time, the concept that John McPhee coined in his book Basin and Range in 1981, the idea that geological time is so vast, so incomprehensibly large, that the normal human frameworks simply don't work for it. 360 million years. You cannot feel that number. Not really. The human brain evolved to process events on timescales of seconds to years, maybe centuries. At the extreme, 360 million years is beyond comprehension in any direct sense. but you can feel the traces of it. The coal in your hand, that was once a tree. The limestone cliff, that was once a seafloor. The dragonfly outside your window who shares a body plan with Meganura, 70 centimeter wingspan. In another world, 360 million years ago, the traces connect you to something unimaginable, through something tangible, through the material world, through the rock and the fossil and the living creature that carries the ancient plan in its genes, what deep time means for us. The Carboniferous was real. As real as today, the trees were alive, the insects were alive, the amphibians were alive, in a world that was as specific as Earth's, with its specific temperature and its specific smell and its specific sounds and its specific light, a world as real as the room you're lying in right now, and it is gone, completely gone. Not one living thing from the Carboniferous is still alive, not one individual. Every organism that was alive in the coal swamp is dead, has been dead for 299 million years at minimum, and yet the world they built is under your feet, in the coal, in the limestone, in the genes of every insect and reptile and mammal that carries the legacy of the Carboniferous forward through time. Nothing is truly gone. Everything leaves a trace in the rock, in the genome, in the atmosphere. In the future, the first forest's lasting gift, what we owe to the coal swamps. I want to end with something that surprised me when I first understood it. The Industrial Revolution to the Carboniferous. The modern world to the Carboniferous. Not just because coal powered the steam engines, not just because the Industrial Revolution was built on coal, but because of what coal enabled: the steam engine, the railway, the factory, the chemical industry, the steel industry, the electrical industry, all built on coal, all powered by the Carboniferous forest, by the stored energy of 300-million-year-old sunlight captured by plants that no longer exist, in a world that no longer exists. And from that Industrial Revolution, the modern world, the connected world, the technological world, the world in which you are lying right now, listening to this, that world came from the coal swamp in a more direct and more profound sense than most people have ever considered. The Carboniferous built the world. You live in not the dinosaurs, not the mammals, not the primates, not the hominins, the trees, the giant trees of the coal swamp 360 million years ago built the world you live in by capturing their carbon and locking it away for us to find. And now we are returning it to the sky as we burn the coal and the oil and the natural gas, all of which were produced by the same process, by ancient life, capturing carbon and storing it for us to find and burn. The Carboniferous is a gift and a warning, both at the same time. And this is the tension we live inside. We are the species that burned the Carboniferous, and we are the species that knows we burned it. No other animal in the 541 million years of complex animal life on Earth has ever understood what it was doing to the planet while it was doing it. The dinosaurs didn't know when the asteroid hit. They had no warning, no understanding, no ability to prepare or prevent or even comprehend. When you burn coal, you are not just releasing energy, you are releasing time, compressed time, 300 million years of captured sunlight released in a single second of combustion. Think about that. Really think about it. 1 second of burning coal releases the energy of 300 million years of photosynthesis, of sunlight falling on leaves that no longer exist, on trees that no longer exist, in a world that no longer exists. We are time travelers. Without knowing it, every time we switch on a light, every time we start a car, every time we heat a home, we are reaching back 300 million years and pulling forward the stored energy of the Carboniferous sun. The Carboniferous sun is powering your life right now, tonight, in the most literal, physical, chemical sense. The light in this room, if it comes from electricity generated by coal, is Carboniferous light, ancient light, reborn in a different form, in a different world, 300 million years later. And when that light falls on your face as you lie here, it is the same energy that once fell on the leaves of Lepidodendron, on the wings of Meganeura, on the dark water of the coal swamp. The same energy, different forms, always the same energy, moving through time from one shape to another. This is what physics teaches us. Energy is never created and never destroyed. It only changes form. The energy in the coal was the energy of the sun, which was the energy of the nuclear reactions at the sun's core, which was the energy of the gravitational collapse that formed the sun, which was the energy of the supernova that scattered the atoms, that became the solar nebula, that became the sun and the earth and the coal and the light in this room and the warmth in your body. You are running on stardust, on supernova energy, on the death of a star that existed before the earth was born. Everything you have ever done, everything you've ever felt, every thought you have ever had was powered by the death of a star billions of years ago. Let that land. Before we continue, the world that coal built, let me tell you about the world that the Carboniferous built, not just the industrial world, not just the steam engines and the factories and the railways, the world of ideas, the world of science, the world of art, the world of philosophy, the world of everything we think of as modern civilization, because without the Industrial Revolution, none of it in its current form would exist. Before coal, before the steam engine, before the factory, human civilization was agricultural. It had been agricultural for 10,000 years, since the Neolithic Revolution, since the first farmers in the Fertile Crescent. Agricultural civilization is limited by the energy of muscle, human muscle, animal muscle, the energy of wind in sails and windmills, the energy of water in water wheels and mill race. All of these are forms of solar energy, current solar energy, the sun shining now on crops that feed the muscles, that do the work, the sun shining now on the ocean, that evaporates water, that falls as rain, that fills the rivers, that turn the water wheels. Current solar energy has limits, hard limits. You can only grow so many crops on so much land. You can only have so many animals pulling so many plows. The energy budget of an agricultural civilization is fixed by the amount of sunlight falling on the land right now, and that limits everything. Population, production, transportation, communication, complexity, everything. The great civilizations of antiquity, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, the Islamic Golden Age, the Renaissance, all of them were running on current solar energy, on the muscles of humans and animals, on wind and water. They were extraordinary. Don't misunderstand me. The Parthenon and the aqueducts of Rome and the Great Wall of China and the mathematics of the Islamic scholars and the art of the Renaissance were extraordinary achievements within the energy budget of an agricultural civilization, but they were limited in ways that we who live after the Industrial Revolution find it difficult to fully appreciate. Most people in every civilization before the Industrial Revolution spend most of their waking hours producing food or providing services directly related to food production. The surplus that allowed specialization, that allowed some people to be artists and philosophers and scientists and priests and soldiers, was thin, always vulnerable to drought and disease and war and crop failure. The Industrial Revolution changed this fundamentally, permanently, by accessing the stored energy of the Carboniferous. Suddenly, there was more energy than the current sun could provide. Suddenly, machines could do what hundreds of human muscles could do. A single steam engine could replace 100 horses, 1,000 human laborers. And with that surplus energy, everything changed. Population grew because more food could be produced. With fewer people working the land, cities grew because people freed from agricultural labor could move to urban centers and specialize in manufacturing and trade and service industries. Science accelerated because there were more people with more time and more resources to devote to understanding the natural world. Medicine improved because science improved, and because there were resources to fund hospitals and laboratories and medical schools. Communication expanded. First the telegraph, then the telephone, then the radio, then the television, then the internet, all powered directly or indirectly by the energy of the Carboniferous. The world you live in, the connected world, the technological world, the world where you can listen to a voice telling you about the coal swamp at 3 a.m. in a bed, in a climate-controlled room with access to almost all of human knowledge, in a device in your pocket. That world is a Carboniferous gift. Without the coal, none of it, as we know it, would exist. This is not a moral judgment. It is a historical observation. The energy of the Carboniferous unlocked a level of human complexity and capability that was not possible on current solar energy alone. And now we are learning to access current solar energy more efficiently than ever before. Solar panels, wind turbines, batteries are becoming the new energy system of civilization. And if we make that transition successfully and quickly enough, we may be able to keep the civilization that the Carboniferous built without continuing to destabilize the climate that makes that civilization possible. This is the great challenge of our moment in the long story of the Earth. We inherited a civilization built on fossil energy, and we need to rebuild it on current energy without losing what the fossil energy made possible. It is the largest engineering and social and political challenge in the history of our species, and whether we meet it will determine the chapter that comes after ours in the long story of life on Earth, the forests of the future. Here is something that I find genuinely hopeful. The forests are returning, not the coal forests, not the Carboniferous. That is gone permanently in the specific form it took, but forests in general, in many parts of the world, are expanding after centuries of contraction. In Europe, forest cover is greater today than it was 100 years ago. The great deforestation of the medieval and early modern periods has been partially reversed by the movement of people from the land to the cities, by the use of fossil fuels for energy instead of wood, by deliberate reforestation efforts. In many countries, in the eastern United States, forests have returned to vast areas that were farmland. In the 19th century, the abandonment of marginal agricultural land as farming consolidated and became more efficient has allowed the forest to come back on its own without human assistance. In many places, this is not the same as the forests that were lost. The biodiversity of a secondary forest growing on abandoned farmland is not the same as the biodiversity of an old-growth forest that had never been cleared. The ecological complexity takes centuries to rebuild, but the trees are coming back, and with the trees, the animals, the insects, the birds, the fungi, the soil organisms that make a forest. And as the trees grow, they are doing what trees have always done, what the Carboniferous trees did on a vastly larger scale. They are pulling CO2 from the atmosphere and locking it in their wood, in their roots, in the soil around them. Trees are carbon capture machines, the most sophisticated and the most ancient carbon capture machines that exist, more sophisticated than anything human engineers have yet designed, more efficient, more self-maintaining, more self-replicating, more ecologically integrated than any technological solution. We have yet developed. A mature forest captures and stores enormous quantities of carbon in the wood of the trees and their roots in the soil, in the fungi that connect the trees, in the mycorrhizal networks that run through the soil, linking tree to tree, sharing nutrients, sharing information in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The mycorrhizal networks, the wood wide web, as some have called it, are one of the most extraordinary discoveries of recent ecology. Trees are not isolated individuals competing with each other for light and water and nutrients. As we once thought, they are connected through fungal networks that run between their roots, sharing carbon, sharing nutrients, sending chemical signals of stress and disease and insect attack. A mother tree, a large old tree in the center of a forest, connected to hundreds of other trees through the fungal network, can send carbon to its seedlings, growing in its shade where they cannot yet photosynthesize enough to survive. On their own, the mother tree feeds its children through the network. This is not metaphor. It is not poetic exaggeration. It is biochemistry. Carbon 14 labeled experiments have shown that carbon fixed by one tree through photosynthesis can appear in the roots of another tree several meters away within hours, transferred through the fungal network. The forest is not a collection of trees. It is a single organism, extended through space, connected through the soil, breathing together, living together, dying together, and being reborn together. The Carboniferous coal swamp was this atascal that covered continents, a single connected living system, breathing and growing and dying and accumulating over 60 million years. And the forests of today are the heirs of that system, reduced, fragmented, threatened, but still running, still breathing, still connecting, still sharing through the networks in the soil. When you walk through a forest, you are walking through a nervous system of another kind, a slow nervous system that processes information over days and weeks and years rather than milliseconds. But a nervous system nonetheless, a connected, responsive, adaptive system that has been running since before the dinosaurs, since before the first flower, since the Carboniferous, and before the insects of the future. And then there are the insects. We are in the middle of an insect apocalypse. This is not an exaggeration. This is what the data shows. Studies across Europe and North America and elsewhere have documented catastrophic declines in insect population. Over the last 50 years, one study in Germany found that the total biomass of flying insects had declined by more than 75% over 27 years in protected nature reserves, not in agricultural land, not in urban areas, in nature reserves where insects should be safe, a 75% decline in total flying insect biomass in less than 30 years. Other studies have found similar declines in different places, different insect groups, different methods, but the same direction, downward, dramatically downward. This matters in ways that go far beyond the aesthetic loss of fewer butterflies and fewer beetles, and fewer bees. On a summer afternoon, insects are the foundation of almost every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. They pollinate the flowering plants that produce most of the food that humans eat, and most of the food that wild animals eat. They decompose dead organic matter, breaking down the fallen leaves and dead wood and dead animals that would otherwise accumulate into a world buried under its own dead. They are prey for birds and bats and reptiles and amphibians and small mammals and fish and other insects. The food webs of almost every ecosystem run through insects at multiple levels. Remove the insects and the food webs collapse. The birds disappear because they have nothing to eat or nothing to feed their chicks. The bats disappear. The reptiles and amphibians decline. The fish that eat aquatic insects decline. And the animals that eat the fish decline. And the plants that depend on insect pollination fail to reproduce. And the animals that depend on those plants decline. The cascade runs through everything because insects are connected to everything. The Carboniferous was the great age of insect diversification, the moment when the insects first spread their wings and claimed the air and the land for themselves. And they have held it for 300 million years. To lose a significant fraction of that diversity in a single human lifetime is to undo in decades what evolution built over hundreds of millions of years. It is the fastest mass extinction of a single animal group that this planet has ever seen, that we know of, and it is happening, largely unnoticed, because insects are small and not charismatic in the way that mammals are charismatic and birds are charismatic. No one makes a documentary about the decline of the hoverfly or the ground beetle or the aquatic mayfly. The way they make documentaries about tigers and elephants and whales, but the hoverfly and the ground beetle and the aquatic mayfly are more important to the functioning of the living world than the tiger or the elephant or the whale. As extraordinary as those animals are, the Carboniferous insects were the beginning of a story that has been running for 300 million years. We are now in a position to end a significant chapter of that story in a single human lifetime. This is the weight of the Carboniferous legacy that we carry, the deep roots of consciousness. Let me take you somewhere different. For a moment, something happened in the Carboniferous that we rarely talk about. When we talk about the coal swamp and the giant insects and the first reptiles, something happened inside the nervous systems of the animals of the coal swamp. Consciousness or something like it was developing. We don't know when consciousness first appeared in the history of life. It is one of the hardest problems in all of science and philosophy, the hard problem of consciousness. Why is there something? It is like to be a living thing. Why does subjective experience exist at all? we don't have an answer. We may never have an answer that fully satisfies, but we can observe that the nervous systems of animals became more complex over time, and that more complex nervous systems are associated with more complex behavior, with more flexible responses to the environment, with what looks from the outside like awareness. The first vertebrates, the Cambrian fish, had simple nervous systems, brains that were little more than clusters of neurons, coordinating basic functions, movement, feeding, reproduction. By the Devonian, the fish brains had grown, had developed new structures, the cerebellum, the optic lobes, the olfactory bulbs, structures that processed more complex information about the world. And by the Carboniferous, the first tetrapods, the amphibians, had brains that were processing the world in ways that went beyond simple reflex, whether they were conscious in the way we are conscious, whether there was something, it was like to be an Eriops lying in the dark water of the coal swamp at night. We cannot know. We genuinely cannot know. But something was happening inside those ancient skulls, something that was the beginning of the long journey that eventually produced the nervous system you are using right now to listen to these words and to experience whatever you are experiencing as you lie here in the dark. Your consciousness, your awareness, your inner life has roots in the Carboniferous, in the nervous systems of the animals, of the coal swamp, in the first complex brains of the first land vertebrates, navigating a world of giant insects and giant trees and dark water. The awareness that you are using right now to be aware of being aware started somewhere in those ancient skulls, in those ancient swamps 300 million years ago, and has been developing ever since through the synapsids and the therapsids and the cynodonts and the first true mammals and the first primates and the first hominins and the first Homo sapiens and every human being who has ever lived. Your awareness is 300 million years old. At least the silence between the sounds, there is something I want you to notice right now, if you can, the silence between the sounds, whatever sounds there are, in your environment right now. The hum of a refrigerator, the sound of traffic, the wind, the rain, the breathing of someone near you, or the complete quiet of a house at 3 a.m. Notice the silence between those sounds, the space in which the sounds exist. That silence is very old, older than the Carboniferous, older than the first sound that any animal ever made. Sound requires a medium, air or water, or a solid, through which pressure waves can travel. The earth had an atmosphere long before the Carboniferous, long before any animal existed to hear anything. The wind made sound before there were ears to hear it. The ocean waves made sound before there were nervous systems to process it. And then, in the Cambrian, the first ears appeared, or the first structures that detected vibration. the first mechanoreceptors that turned the pressure waves of the physical world into signals in a nervous system, and for the first time, the universe was heard by something not heard in the way we hear, not processed into the rich, complex, subjective experience of sound that you are having right now as you listen, but detected, responded to, used, and from that first detection of vibration through 541 million years of nervous system evolution, we arrive at you, lying in the dark, hearing, not just detecting, but experiencing the sound of the words, the rhythm of the sentences, the music of the language, in a way that no Cambrian animal, no Carboniferous amphibian, no Cretaceous dinosaur ever could. You are at the far end of a very long journey in the evolution of hearing, and the silence between the sounds is the same silence that existed before the first ear, before the first nervous system, before the first living cell. The silence is ancient, more ancient than life, more ancient than the earth. The silence is the universe itself before anything happened in it, and you can hear it right now between the sounds. If you listen, that ancient silence, holding the sounds of your specific moment on this specific night, in this specific life, the geology under your dreams as you sleep tonight, your brain will do something extraordinary. It will replay and process and consolidate the experiences of the day in the form of dreams. Dreams are one of the great mysteries of neuroscience. We know at a mechanical level what happens in the brain during REM sleep when most dreaming occurs. The hippocampus replays the day's experiences to the cortex, which integrates them into long-term memory. The prefrontal cortex, which regulates rational thought, is less active, which is why dreams are often strange and illogical and emotionally intense in ways that waking experience usually is not. But why we experience the replaying as something, as a dream, as a subjective narrative, rather than simply as unconscious processing, that is the hard problem again. Why there's something, it is like to dream as well as simply to sleep, we don't know. But the dreaming brain is very old. REM sleep has been identified in all mammals and in birds and possibly in reptiles, suggesting that the neuromechanism of REM sleep evolved before the split between birds and mammals, before the Cretaceous, before the Jurassic, possibly in the late Triassic, or even the late Permian, the synapsids, the mammal-like reptiles of the Permian, the descendant of the first amniotes of the Carboniferous, may have dreamed. Dimetrodon, the sail-backed synapsid of the early Permian, may have experienced something during the night in the desert landscapes of ancient Pangaea when its brain processed the day. We can't know. We genuinely cannot know, but the possibility is there in the evolutionary logic of sleep. And if Dimetrodon dreamed Then the capacity for dreaming traces back through the synapsids to the first amniotes, to the coal swamp, to the Carboniferous. Your dreams tonight may be a Carboniferous inheritance. The brain that dreams began in the coal swamp, the sound of the Carboniferous. I want to give you something to carry into sleep. A sound, the sound of the Carboniferous. Close your eyes and imagine you are standing at the edge of the coal swamp. At dusk, the light is failing. The canopy above is becoming a dark silhouette against an orange sky. And the sound rise. The insects are beginning their night chorus, the stridulation of ancient orthoptera, not quite crickets, not quite grasshoppers, something between, something that has no modern equivalent, a sound that no human ear has ever heard, but that we can imagine from the fossils of the sound-producing structures of Carboniferous insects, a complex, layered, continuous sound rising and falling from every direction, from the reeds and the tree fern fronds and the roots of the lepidodendron trees, and above that, the occasional deep rhythmic pulse of Meganera crossing the sky on its way from the roost to the hunting ground, and from the water, the soft sounds of amphibians moving at the surface, calling to each other in whatever sounds Carboniferous amphibians made, and the wind moving through the canopy, the sound of 300 million year old leaves against 300 million year old bark in the warm, humid, oxygen-rich air of the coal swamp evening. This sound no one has ever heard. It exists only in the deep past, in the absolute silence of geological time, but it happened. It was real. The pressure waves moved through the air of the Carboniferous evening for millions of years, every evening for 60 million years. The coal swamp made its sounds into an atmosphere that had no one to hear them, and then 300 million years later, in a room somewhere on the surface of the same planet, a human being lies in the dark and imagines them, and in the imagining they exist again in a different form, in the mind of the person who is imagining everything that has ever happened on this planet still exists. In this way, in the possibility of being imagined by a mind that comes after, nothing is truly lost. As long as there are minds to imagine it, this is what we do. This is what makes us the specific kind of creature we are. We imagine the past, and in imagining it, we extend it into the present. The Carboniferous is alive. Right now, in your mind, as you listen, the coal swamp is real right now in the space behind your closed eyes, and the giant dragonfly is crossing the darkening sky. One more time before you sleep, the carbon in your breath. One more thing before sleep takes you, the carbon in your next breath out, the CO2 you are about to exhale contains carbon atoms that have been many things before they were part of you. Some of them were part of the food you ate today, which was part of a plant, or an animal that ate a plant, which captured carbon from the atmosphere recently in the last year or two, but some of the carbon that passes through your body over a lifetime has a longer history, has been part of other organisms in the past, has been in the atmosphere before, in cycles that stretch back through time. Carbone is ancien. Every carbon atom on Earth was forged in a star before the sun existed and has been cycling through the Earth system since the planet formed, through the atmosphere and the ocean and the rock and living things, and back again for 4.5 billion years. The carbon in your body has been in the atmosphere of the Carboniferous, almost certainly has been part of a Carboniferous tree, almost certainly has been in the coal and released into the modern atmosphere by burning and breathed in by you. The carbon cycle connects you to the Carboniferous in the most direct physical, chemical sense. You are made in part of Carboniferous carbon, and when you breathe out, you return it to the atmosphere for a while until a plant captures it again and incorporates it into a leaf or a root or a stem. And when that plant dies, the carbon returns to the air or to the soil or to the ocean and cycles on as it has cycled for 4.5 billion years. You are a temporary structure. In the carbon cycle, a moment when carbon atoms organize themselves into a form that could be aware of being a form in the carbon cycle, and then the carbon will move on into other forms, into other organisms, into the air and the soil and the rock. But for now, the carbon is you, and you are here, and you are aware. And that awareness is the most extraordinary thing that the carbon cycle has ever produced. As far as we know, more extraordinary than the Carboniferous forest, more extraordinary than Meganeura, more extraordinary than the amniotic, because the carbon in the Carboniferous forest did not know it was in a forest, but the carbon in you knows it is in you and knows about the forest and the coal and the cycle and the stars and the deep time and the silence between the sounds. The carbon has become aware of itself through you. The last thing before sleep, I want you to do something. As you fall asleep tonight, I want you to imagine that you can feel the rotation of the earth. You can't feel it, not really. The rotation is too smooth, too continuous. Your inner ear detects acceleration, not constant motion, and the earth rotates at a constant speed. So there's nothing to detect, no sensation of motion, but the motion is real. The earth is turning right now at about 1,000 kilometers per hour at the equator, slower at higher latitudes, but still turning. And as it turns, the part of the surface where you are is moving from the night side toward the day side, or from the day side toward the night side, depending on what time it is where you are. And the stars above you appear to rotate around the earth because of this motion. The ancient navigators knew the stars by their positions at different times of year, different times of night, because the Earth's rotation and its orbit around the sun move the stars across the sky in predictable patterns, the same stars that the navigators used to find their way across the ocean, the same stars that were above the coal swamp in the Carboniferous, the same stars that have been above every human being who has ever lived and died on this planet, and they are above you right now, even if you can't see them, even if there are clouds or city lights or a roof between you and them. They are there, the same stars, shining in the same silence that they have always shone in, and the earth is turning, slowly carrying you with it through the dark toward the light, and below you, layers of rock go down through geological time, layer by layer, millennium by millennium, through the recent and the ancient, through the ice ages and the age of mammals and the age of dinosaurs and the Permian and the Carboniferous, all the way down to the oldest rock, the Hadean, the Hell World, the molten beginning 4.5 billion years ago. You are on top of all of it, on the surface of 4.5 billion years of Earth history, looking up at billions of years of stellar history, breathing in 3 billion years of biological history, and aware of all of it in this moment, in this specific, unrepeatable, present moment. Let the awareness settle, let the breath slow in and out. The coal swamp is below you, compressed into rock, into the foundations of the world. The stars are above you, burning in the silence. That was there before any of this existed, and you are exactly where you are at exactly this moment in the long story, and it is enough, more than enough. It is everything the Carboniferous is done for tonight. The giant dragonfly has returned to wherever Jean Dragonfly go. When they are done, the coal swamp is quiet, the dark water is still, the canopy is motionless. In the warm, heavy ancien terre, and the world is turning, carrying everything into tomorrow, into the next chapter of the long story that began in the stars and has been running ever since, without stopping, without pause, without end. Inside, you are part of it. The most recent part, the most aware part, the part that knows it is a part, and for now, that is enough. Sleep, the deep time, will hold you as it holds everything, always. Closing the long breath. We have traveled far tonight, 360 million years, into a world that most people have never imagined. We have stood in the coal swamp where the trees grew, Für du mir das Tal, and the water was black and the air was thick, and something with a 70-centimeter wingspan passed overhead. In the dim light, we have looked at arthropods moving through the undergrowth, 2.5 meters long, patient, ancien, eating fallen leaves, in a world that had no concept of what a mammal was, or a dinosaur, or a human being. We have stood beside Hylonomus, the small lizard-like animal in the hollow stump of a dead lepidodendron tree, watching it without its knowledge and knowing that everything we are, every vertebrate on land, comes from animals like this. From this moment, from this innovation of the amniote egg in the coal swamp, we have felt the weight of deep time, the 360 million years between the coal swamp and this room, between Meganura and the moths at your window, between arthropods and the centipede in your garden. Deep time is not a concept, it is a feeling, and it is a feeling worth having because it puts everything in perspective, every conflict, every anxiety, every small urgency of the daily world against 360 million years of a planet that has survived everything, that has rebuilt itself from every catastrophe, that has produced world after world, each one stranger and more extraordinary than the last. The coal under your feet is the evidence of that persistence, of that patient, accumulated world building that the earth has been doing since before any complex life existed. To witness it, let your breathing slow. Let the images settle. The black water, the tall trees, the green light filtering down through the canopy, the sound of wings somewhere above, too large for this world, but real in another 360 million years ago. The ground you're lying on connects to all of it. Go deep enough and you are in the Carboniferous, in the coal, in the compressed bodies of trees that were alive when the only vertebrates on land were small and new and just beginning the longest journey in the history of life. Rest now. The coal swamp is still here, under everything, under the cities, under the fields, under the centuries, under the millennia, under the millions of years, waiting as it has always waited in the dark, in the deep, close your eyes. The world before the dinosaurs is dreaming, and you can dream with it.